Hello. On behalf of my colleagues at the Board of Trustees of the SEC Historical Society, I want to welcome everyone joining us today for this special program, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act at 20, A Corporate Governance Legacy. My name is Jim Barrett, and I'm currently a director at the global consulting firm of AlixPartners in Washington, D.C. I'm a CPA and forensic accountant with over 30 years of experience assisting law firms, companies, and board committees facing difficult issues involving financial fraud, regulatory investigations, and anti-bribery compliance and remediation. I also served as an enforcement accountant at the SEC for approximately 6 years. In addition to my day job at AlixPartners, I also serve as the president of the SEC Historical Society Board of Trustees. And if you're unfamiliar with the Historical Society, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are not legally affiliated with the SEC, but we obviously share an appreciation of the agency's important mission to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. The Society works to preserve and share the history of the SEC's efforts in carrying out their mission. And we do this by continually expanding the collection of unique materials in our virtual museum, which you can visit at sechistorical.org. The museum is freely accessible to anyone with an internet connection, and I urge you to take a look if you haven't already. It's a tremendous resource. And now I want to introduce our accomplished panelists for today's program. The webcast we're preserving today is part of a larger gallery being curated by Dave Lynn on the history of the regulation of corporate disclosure. Dave, who will be moderating the panel, is a partner at Morrison & Foerster, where he is co-chair of the firm's corporate finance and capital markets practice. From 2003 to 2007, he served as chief counsel in the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance. He initially served on the SEC staff from 1995 to 2000 as an attorney advisor and subsequently as a special counsel in the Division of Corp Fin. Dave also served on the SEC Historical Society's Board of Trustees as president and chairman, and he remains a staunch and loyal supporter of our mission. I want to thank you, Dave, for your many years of support of the Society and for your efforts relating to curating this gallery, including moderating this panel today. Next is Harvey Pitt. Harvey Pitt is Chief Executive Officer of the global strategic business consulting firm, Kalorama Partners, and its law firm affiliate, Kalorama Legal Services. Prior to founding the Kalorama firms, Harvey served as the 26th chairman of the SEC from 2001 to 2003. He had served previously with the Commission from 1968 to 1978, including as the Commission's general counsel from 1975 to 1978. For nearly 25 years before serving as the SEC chairman, Harvey was a senior corporate partner at Fried Frank. Importantly for this organization, Harvey was a founding trustee and the first president of the SEC Historical Society, and remains one of our staunchest supporters, which we appreciate. Welcome, Harvey, and thank you for being here today. Next, Alan Beller. Alan Beller is senior counsel at the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb, where he has served nearly 40 years of his career. He was recruited from Cleary to serve as the SEC's division, as director of the Division of Corporation Finance and senior counselor to the Commission from January 2002 until February 2006, after which he returned to the firm. Alan also served on the SEC Historical Society's Board of Advisors and the Board of Trustees. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today and for your service to the organization. Next, we have Shelley Parrott. Shelley left the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance in 2001 after 35 years of service to the Commission. She served as the division's deputy director since 2003 and as the division's acting director 3 separate times. Shelley is in her first term on the SEC Historical Society's Board of Advisors. So I welcome you, Shelley, and thank you for your service and for bringing your expertise to today's program. And last but not least is my friend Emery Tierney. She is the founder and principal of Liquid Advisors. Previously, she was the chief strategy officer and general counsel of Templum Inc. and served as head of strategy at Nasdaq Private Market and as the general counsel of Second Market Inc., now Digital Currency Group. She also worked at the SEC, Skadden Arps, the NYSE, and NYFIX. Anne-Marie, thank you for bringing your deep market experience, particularly at the NYSE, to the program today.
Thank you.
Again, I appreciate all of our panelists for being here today and for taking time to prepare for what I expect will be a very informative discussion. And with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jim, and thank you to the panelists for joining me today, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in to understand a little bit more about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was enacted in July 30th, 2002, in the midst of what was really a crisis situation in our financial markets. And looking back 20 years now, I think it's important today to really understand the historical context in which the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was enacted, and the context in which the SEC and the stock exchanges took really extraordinary steps to try to restore confidence in our public companies and in our markets. And, when you look back at some of the major accounting scandals of the day, including things like Enron and Tyco International, Adelphia Communications, WorldCom, obviously, those cost investors billions of dollars in lost value, but at the same time, it sort of cost our the general public and participants in our markets the confidence in what was happening and what the next shoe was going to drop, essentially. And that really was a profound impact on the confidence in the markets and the operation of our financial regulation system. And because those scandals that I mentioned very often involved accounting matters and auditing issues, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is often remembered, and the SEC's efforts to implement the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is often remembered for how it really reshaped the approach to our financial reporting and auditing system in the form of things like the evaluation of internal control of our financial reporting and the establishment and implementation of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. But one thing we wanted to explore today and really keep in mind is a lot of those accounting scandals came about due to corporate governance failures, and many of the things that came out of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, out of the SEC's own independent efforts of the era and the efforts that were undertaken by the stock exchanges was really focused on enhancing the corporate governance environment going forward, and really changing the approach to corporate governance in a way that it makes it hard for us to even recognize what corporate governance looked like 20 years ago before all of this happened. And at the same time, it's very important, I think, to keep in mind how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the independent activities that the SEC was undertaking at the time really changed the approach that the SEC took to regulating the disclosure of public companies and the approach to reviewing and monitoring those disclosures over time. And we'll also explore that because I think that has an important element to contributing to the corporate governance environment that we see prevail today. So what we'll do is really take a look back at that legislative and regulatory environment in which Sarbanes-Oxley came about, and then focus on the implementation at the SEC, at the stock exchanges, and how that really changed the approach from a governance perspective across the board. So to start off, we really wanted to pick up with I think the historical context in which all this happened, which was really the lead up to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and what was going on at the time across the landscape, I think, similar to the environment that we face today, there had been a period of a prolonged run in the stock market, ever increasing stock prices, which were sort of lifting all boats, essentially, which really sort of reached their peak in March of 2020, and then began what ended up being a fairly precipitous decline, which resulted in the markets entering sort of bear market territory by 2001. And I think it's fair to say, as the markets slumped, the dominoes began to fall, essentially. And what we saw beginning in the fall of 2001 was the Enron scandal was publicized, and the information about Enron broke, and then things rapidly deteriorated when Enron was unable to find a buyer, or that deal fell through, and then eventually resulted in bankruptcy. Early in the next year, 2002, we saw the news about Tyco International, and that scandal was first publicized, which ultimately led to the arrest of the CEO and CFO by the fall of 2002. We saw in March of 2002 the Adelphia Communications scandal first broke. In May, there was a company called Peregrine Systems that had a big accounting scandal. And then by June of 2002, WorldCom really sort of was the shot heard around the world in terms of an extraordinarily large accounting scandal. And so I think perhaps the best place to start, Harvey, is what was happening at the SEC during this time frame? What was the SEC doing in response to these corporate scandals and this concern about a declining level of confidence in the markets?
Thanks, Dave. Before I respond, I just want to thank the Historical Society and thank you for putting this program together. And it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. The events at that time were shocking to us, and shoes kept dropping repeatedly. We were, to put it bluntly, dying death by 1,000 cuts almost every single day. So we had in mind our own program. I think up until WorldCom, we were not clear that there would be any federal legislation whatsoever. So we had our own regulatory program going, one part of which was to require corporations, and we had thought about the 1,000 largest corporations, to disclose what difficulties they might have been having. We wanted to get all of this out, and the key date, as I recall it, was August 14th. We created an investigation, which was unusual because it was a Corp Fin investigation, not an enforcement investigation, designed to disclose what difficulties companies would be having. We also were preparing to create what was our own version of what became the PCAOB eventually, and to try to take steps to require greater disclosures. The Division of Corporation Finance with Allen and Shelley was incredibly active. So we had an entire program working to try and stem the flow, stop the hemorrhaging, and provide notice to the public of what was going on with public companies.
Yeah, I think there's steps that you described, Harvey, is interesting because it wasn't like there was an established toolkit to do this. It was really trying to come up with things that perhaps had never been tried before in that regard, and coming up with some novel approaches that really were suited for a situation of this magnitude.
That's true. I have to say we were blessed because the staff of the SEC was amazing throughout all of this. And I give due credit to my co-panelists, but the staff of the commission was just amazing in their dedication and their determination, working around the clock and working as a collective unit. I couldn't have been prouder to have been involved with the men and women of the SEC staff and of the self-regulatory bodies. It was a time when people really stepped up and showed their true colors and merits, and those colors and merits were fabulous in my view.
And I think
Dave, one among the things that didn't really have precedence and demonstrated the staff dedication in a very significant way, and Shelley was closer to this. She was one of the first things I did when I got there in January of 2002 was to ask Shelley if she would become the deputy director of the division, and she was foolish enough to say yes, and I was lucky enough that she said yes. But we, before Sarbanes-Oxley, well before I think anybody in Congress was talking about it, really revamped the review system. And that was done by the commission and by the staff on its own. And it was only successful because we were way understaffed when Enron happened. And I think we hired 200 or 300 people in the 3 years after Enron. But our staff, to a person, really put in the extra effort needed to review the Fortune 100, then review the Fortune 250, and to focus on financial reviews, to do things that were really, they were different in the playbook, and they were the direct result of staff thinking and staff dedication.
Yeah, Shelley, I think that's a good segue into what was really sort of the view on the ground in CorpFin at that time when faced with such a extraordinary set of circumstances, and how did the division sort of pivot to address these circumstances?
I think that's really a great question, and I think that people with boots on the ground were very concerned about how the disclosure review program, the division, and the SEC would be criticized for not being a better cop on the beat. There is no way, I know everyone on this panel knows that there is no way that a compliance review is going to catch intentional non-compliance, intentional misdeeds, fraud. There's no way that a compliance review will catch that. But when something happens, the world focuses on the SEC and the staff saying, where were you? Why didn't you catch this? And it's personally, for the people who are involved in the were involved in the reviews of the companies, it was very concerning because they knew that there would be focus on them and criticism of them. As Alan said, we were way ahead of the game on working on trying to change the review process or the disclosure review program from a program that was focused on the transactional filings to the review of ongoing periodic annual and current reports, because when you sat down and looked at the numbers, the resources that we were putting into the review of transactional filings far outweighed the resources we were putting into periodic reports. And the dollar volume of the money that companies were raising in this transaction was dwarfed by the average daily trading volume in the markets. So we had, as Alan said, we had already begun rethinking what our focus would be and how we would do it. And we did publish a report on what we found in our 2002 review of the Fortune 500 companies from 2001. That was just the beginning of this work. And Sarbanes-Oxley just reaffirmed what we were doing was the right thing to do. And it really, we were ahead of the game, but there was a lot of game to still play.
Yeah, it's interesting how there was such a focus on the review process at the SEC when many of these situations, the company's own auditors never caught these issues, and they were sitting, right next door to the chief accounting officer and the like. And so it is a sort of an interesting concept that down in Washington, someone looking at a filing should somehow catch some of these problems. I guess that highlights something that I think is an important aspect of this that should not be overlooked, in that there was so much happening in parallel in this time frame, that there was so much already underway at the SEC to address the issues at the exchanges, to address these issues, that some of the things in Sarbanes-Oxley sort of reflected those efforts. And some dealt with other topics that weren't necessarily being done by the SEC just because the SEC wasn't, authorized to do them. And I guess, Harvey, that sort of raises the question of what was it like at the time in terms of the interaction between the SEC and the lawmakers who were considering Sarbanes-Oxley, and how did that play out in terms of the give and take there?
Well, I think we enjoyed good relationships with people on the Hill, and our staff was in contact with the committees. But one thing about Sarbanes-Oxley, which was different, was that the statute itself was congressionally initiated. This wasn't an SEC initiation, although we had a fair amount of input into it. The one thing we didn't have input into were the stringent deadlines that were included in the statute. It was almost as if we were given impossible deadlines, and the resolve that all of us had was we were going to meet the deadlines. And Congress had spoken eventually, and we were determined to do what Congress had directed us to do. But I would say that we had good communications with people on the Hill when they wanted technical support. Our staff felt free to provide whatever it was. There were no restraints put on anyone. Not that those would have been successful had we tried, but the commission is in part obligated to be responsive to Congress. We gave Congress whatever help we could. And I think that there was, on balance between our staff and congressional staff, a good working relationship.
And you touched on this earlier, that there, as with any piece of congressional legislation, sort of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act didn't start out life as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It was an accumulation of many different pieces of of legislative initiatives that were working their way through Congress in the time frame. But WorldCom came along, and that really changed the dynamic. How did WorldCom change that dynamic, and why was that such an important moment?
I would start by saying up until WorldCom, it was unclear that there would be any legislation at all. WorldCom, in a word, was a game changer. When that shoe dropped, suddenly congressional resolve to adopt the statute was manifest, and it became clear that Congress was going to act. This was a gargantuan failure in the system, and it was a shock to everyone. And I think it is safe to say it mobilized congressional activity immediately. From that point on, it was clear we were going to have a statute.
Yeah, that really changed, Dave. In 24 hours between the afternoon when the CFO of WorldCom called the SEC and said, we're about to make an announcement that we have a little financial disclosure problem. And the noon of the next day, it absolutely became 100% clear that the question was no longer would there be legislation, but what would it say? How fast could they get it passed? Would anyone vote against it? And I mean, I think my recollection is that in both houses together, there were 3 votes against the bill, the Sarbanes-Oxley in the final vote. It was, 27 million to 3. And that's an interesting factoid, but it's also important context for what Harvey was quite correctly saying in terms of, one of the things we didn't expect, ask for, or need was do 23 rulemakings in 6 months. Actually, we were told to do 2 rulemakings in 2 weeks, and the others in 6 months. It was we did 23 rulemakings. They were all adopted by the commission by both the proposing and the final releases by a 5-0 vote. It was done because the staff worked incredibly hard. The commission worked incredibly hard. The 5 commissioners were dedicated to having an absolute open door policy with the staff. Any issue, we want to hear about it. The staff was completely committed to having an open door policy with the commission. Anything we think is something you want to know about, we will make sure you know about it. And that's the way you get that done that quickly and that effectively. Having said all that, the political environment of 27 million to 3 makes it easier to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it was a pretty fast turnaround when you think about, from June when WorldCom came down to the end of July, that the legislation, such a big piece of legislation could get completed in that short of a time. And Alan, I guess one follow-up question is, you were in a very unique position in a sense because you had been in private practice, representing companies up until January of 2001, as a lot of these issues were happening and the concerns were unfolding, and then became director of corporation finance in the beginning of 2001, just roughly 7 months before this legislation got passed. how did that impact your approach? I mean, you sort of were seeing this from both sides of the counsel to the companies and then regulator of the companies.
Well, first of all, it was January 2002, just to be
2002, yes, I'm sorry. Yep.
and this is a fairly personal reflection. I mean, when I left Cleary in December of 01, Harvey and I agreed I'd go through the selection process in Thanksgiving of 01. I was named sometime around there. I quit my job at Cleary at the end of 01, started at the middle of 02, January 02. I don't want to suggest that I was in any way prescient about what I found. I had been concerned for a long time, and the dot-com bust was a manifestation of it for me, and that was March of 21, excuse me. Our disclosure system needed improvement and updating, but I would never pretend to tell you that before Enron filed for bankruptcy in December or I showed up in January, I had a playbook or an idea as to what was called for in the aftermath of Enron, because I was as shocked by it, frankly, as everybody else. I think the fact that I knew my way around the way companies think and behave and the way they make disclosure decisions, good ones and bad ones, and the way they make, I'm not an accountant, but the way I know a little bit about accounting, the way they make accounting decisions, good ones and bad ones, probably was of some considerable help to me in being able to get my arms around what I was facing more quickly. But the fact that I had been on the other side was not great preparation for what I found when I showed up at CorpFin.
I just have to say here, I think the single greatest thing I did as SEC chairman was get Alan Beller to join the staff. I had a lot of help from his then partner, Ed Green, who said, "You'll never get him, but I'll help." And all I can say is from there, the rest was history. But Alan and Shelley leading the division made such a tremendous difference and an impact that I think it deserves great mention as a single terrific moment in the history of the commission.
You were very kind, Harvey. It was pretty good. This is one last personal comment. It was certainly one of the best, if not the best thing that ever happened to me professionally. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up sort of this phase of it, I guess my thesis at the beginning was, at the core, while these were accounting scandals that prompted all of this activity, at the core there was really sort of a governance failure that led to this, and I'm interested in the perspectives of anyone on the panel who wants to share just what was happening at that time in corporate governance, or what was not happening, that really laid the groundwork for these types of scandals to happen, and how did that really influence what Congress decided to address and what the SEC and the exchanges ultimately decided to address in the aftermath?
I'll take a short crack at that. I want to hear what others said. as well. I mean, point number one you mentioned, the single most important lesson of the events that came to light in early middle 2002 were that the numbers matter. If you don't get the numbers right, you haven't got a chance, or investors don't have a chance. If you don't get the numbers right, investors don't have a chance. I don't think I appreciated that as much as I do now when I showed up. But I think the other governance things are very important, and Sarbanes-Oxley was critical to them, notwithstanding that people, I think, correctly think of Sarbanes-Oxley as an auditing and accounting effort principally. The first thing I'd say is that disclosure processes and commitment to disclosure quality makes a difference. And I would say that they weren't earth-shaking changes, but they had a very significant role in the way companies thought about disclosure. One was the very simple one: let's make CEOs and CFOs sign their names to the K's and the Q's. It sounds idiotic, but it's not. And the second thing was you back that up with a set of what we call disclosure controls and procedures, different from internal control, which was what Sarbanes-Oxley was largely all about. But the mantra we had was, we want a system whereby CEOs and CFOs have access to everything they need to decide whether the disclosure is right or not. And then we're going to make them put their signatures on a piece of paper. The second part was the certification, and which kind of the high profile sideshow. The important part was the disclosure controls that made companies think about how they decided what to disclose and what not to disclose. And there really wasn't a formalized process at most companies for doing that pre-Sarbanes-Oxley and pre-2002. And I think that just made an enormous difference.
I can talk a little bit about, what was happening. You talked about corporate governance, and I can talk about a little bit what was happening at the NYSE in the run up to this period. They were also already focused on corporate governance in a very big way. And the New York Stock Exchange launched a Blue Ribbon panel committee in 1998, I think the fall of 1988, when Arthur Levitt noted, issues with audit committee oversight of financial statements. So that was already in process, way before the significant events that we're talking about. And then that report was adopted. I'm just looking at the date in February 1999. So as early as February 1999, the New York Stock Exchange had already put together a suite of best practices around corporate governance, and those were adopted for listed companies, in the months following that. So there was a good focus on corporate governance because of other issues that preceded Sarbanes-Oxley. The proposals from the NYSE that we ultimately adopted included, independent audit committee, independent compensation committee, processes and procedures around what the board was required to do in order for things to be approved. Outside approval for shareholder approval of equity compensation plans, so there couldn't be kind of misdeeds around equity comp. So that was already a big part of what at least the New York Stock Exchange was looking at in the run-up to Sarbanes-Oxley. And I think working quite closely with the SEC on all those matters.
Great. Thank you all. And I think moving on then to sort of enactment and implementation, were there any aspects of what ultimately was enacted as Sarbanes-Oxley that were a surprise to the SEC, to the commissioners or the staff that presented any special challenges, or was just sort of out of left field?
Well, I think to start with, the deadlines were, let me just say, a huge surprise. They were stringent, they were difficult, but again, as I mentioned, because of the great efforts of our staff and the commissioners, we worked together as a collaborative whole, and that wasn't a problem. I think we had asked for certifications, and our form of certifications were very simple. They basically required CEOs and CFOs to say anything we know that we think should be deemed important by a shareholder, we've disclosed, and we don't know of anything significant that hasn't been disclosed. That got changed. We wound up with two provisions in the legislation. One was a civil provision. The other was a criminal provision. And when you're at a regulatory agency, you don't get to criticize Congress, but creating that as a criminal statute, and particularly in such stringent form, was also a surprise. And it created difficulties for us because we had to work around the two differing provisions. I had thought the way we had come up with it initially, and I again credit Alan and Shelley for that, was far better than the formation we got statutorily, but we didn't have a choice. We had to implement what Congress gave us, and so we did. I would say that was a surprise as well. And then some of the review requirements, as Alan and Shelley have indicated, we were already revising the review process, but Congress saw fit to tell us how to do it. And to some extent, that was a surprise as well.
Yeah. Now, Alan, you mentioned the extraordinary agenda and how everyone approached it just to get that rulemaking done in such a rapid pace, and that required, I'm sure, an extraordinary amount of creativity as well to propose and adopt rules in such a tight time frame. And there's lots of situations where you had to pick your battles and decide whether to pursue rulemaking in an area or just ask people to, sort of rely on their own interpretations, or you had to bifurcate things like internal controls over financial reporting and disclosure controls and procedures to address sort of the time frames in which you had to work. I'd be interested in your thoughts on, sort of how you came up with some of those ideas and how you decided what things to pick your battles on.
I think it's fair. There was a lot of consultation with the commission, and with respect to certain of the rules, with other divisions. For example, the attorney conduct rules. I don't know. We remember those. CorpFin and the General Counsel's Office worked very closely together on those with several of the commissioners. the internal controls rules, the chief accountant's office, and we worked very closely together. And so a lot of the, one head, two heads are almost always better than one, and four heads are almost always better than two. I think that some of our success is directly attributable to the fact that we were very open to collaboration. There was actually, thinking back 20 years, there was remarkably little ego involved in this whole process. And that was really important. But yeah, we did have some decisions to make. I'll give you an example of one where we spent an inordinate amount of time. And this was a little bit my personal hobby horse, the audit committee independence rules, which were fundamental to the statute. And there was certainly no one on the commission who was not fully committed to the statutory provisions. But especially in the context of some of our non-US reporting companies, they were simply not workable. I'll give a very small example. In Germany, half the members of your supervisory board have to be members of labor. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, that made them affiliates. That meant they could not be members of the audit committee. And so we developed workarounds, particularly with some of the audit committee provisions, had unanimous buy-in from the commission that they were the right way to go, adopted them, and notwithstanding the fact that the Congress had passed what it passed, we got zero pushback from the Congress on what we ultimately came up with, which I think, we got it at least half right. An example of something where we decided not to do something is the loan provisions. There's a provision in Sarbanes-Oxley that makes it illegal for a company to extend credit to its executive officers. It's a unlike most of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is Congress directs the SEC to do this, that, and the other thing. This was a self-executing provision. It's a blanket prohibition in pretty much the terms I just described. And we got a lot of pressure from companies, and even more so from the bar, to provide some interpretive gloss on the statute, and maybe even to provide some exemptions from the statute to allow companies to continue to make extensions of credit that were quote unquote good, instead of the bad old extensions of credit that the statute was intended to avoid. And we said, no, you can read the statute just as well as we can. And secondly, and the commission, again, 100%, we consulted, they were 100% behind us. The SEC is not in the business of providing exemptions to a statute that was just passed by 27 million to 3. That's just not the business the regulatory agency is in. And we got a lot of pushback on that. I, to this day, believe it was the right thing to do, but that was, those were the kinds of decisions we made.
Great, thanks for that. I guess with the benefit of 20 years of hindsight here, I wonder if any of you think there was something you would do differently today if you were faced with the same set of circumstances, the crisis as well as the responding to the legislative directives.
I guess I would say we didn't handle everything perfectly, but I think we handled everything well. Again, I give credit to the staff. I also give credit to my fellow commissioners, because we functioned as a collaborative whole. The staff was basically told, raise whatever issue you want with all of the commissioners. And if commissioners have issues, deal with it. We were impeded, as has always been the case since 1978, by the Government and the Sunshine Act, which continues, in my view, to be one of the worst pieces of legislation ever, because it prevents a multi-member regulatory body from really communicating well. And so our communications were effectively by the staff. The staff was told, you speak to a commissioner, tell them everything they need to know, hold nothing back, and make sure that everybody is fully informed. The result was, as Alan mentioned, we passed every one of the rules 5-zip. And I think in today's environment, that would be a lot harder to achieve, but we had just very dedicated efforts on the part of the staff. People were working around the clock, and what was so amazing was tempers didn't fray. People got along with one another, and I don't want to say it was idyllic, but you had to have been there, as all of us were, in a sense, to know how collaboratively and constructively everyone, without exception, everyone participated in this, so we could get the rules drafted and out for comment and done. So I am sure there were things that could have been done better, but by and large, I have to say, thanks to our staff, we did this quite well.
Great. We touched before on the fact that the Division of Corporation Finance had really been looking at the way it does its reviews and looking at its operations as the crisis was unfolding. But then the Sarbanes-Oxley Act itself included a directive for the SEC to change the approach from a review standpoint. And Shelley, I guess, be interested in just hearing what sort of challenges did the division face having to respond to that particular directive?
Huge challenges. That's all I can say. There's nothing more beyond that. So when Section 8 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was laid at our feet, that was pretty daunting. And we had always tried to maintain a presence in the review of periodic and current reports, but clearly Congress thought we could do more. The 408 mandate led us to think about what our how to change our review procedures and how to come up with a schedule to review in accordance with both the letter and the spirit of 408. I think for context, it's really important to remember that 408 laid at our feet a mandate to review every reporting company at least once every 3 years. We estimated at that time we had between 15 and 17,000 reporting companies, and we had just about 100 accountants in the division. And so how are, going back to, it was a huge challenge. How are we going to get there from here? So the first thing we focused on was what our review procedures should be. And we knew that we wanted to continue focusing our resources over to the review of the periodic reports. And up until 2002, the disclosure review program would pick up 10Ks for review as time permitted. We did not have a framework for systematically identifying companies for review. We would review companies when we could. And we would undertake certain projects for issues or industries, but we just didn't have that systematic process that Sarbanes-Oxley led us to put in place. So in the 5 years leading up to the adoption of the Act, CorpFin had reviewed between 1,500 and 2,800 reporting companies every year. So if you take 15,000 and divide that by 3, clearly, hitting at least 5,000 companies a year was going to take some effort. So we came up with a comprehensive plan to meet the requirements. We started with dividing the companies into 3 groups. The first group included the top 1,000 companies by market capitalization. That was meant to mimic what the commission might consider for company registration. Group 2 was the next 6,000 companies, and group 3 was all the rest. We looked at our review scopes, traditionally a full review, a financial statement review, and what we called a monitor. And we thought it was appropriate to add an additional category of review, which was a preliminary review. And in a preliminary review, we would substantively evaluate the adequacy of a company's disclosures. And an experienced CorpFin accountant would read a substantial portion of a company's annual report, make substantive evaluations about the adequacy of the disclosures, and recommend whether further evaluation was appropriate. And the one note I want to make here that all of us know is that CorpFin staff was not and never will be in a position to judge the accuracy of a company's disclosures. So we were focused on the adequacy of the disclosures. And what we did in developing the preliminary review was just following on what we did with the Fortune 500. So a preliminary review was very different from the traditional screening process that CorpFin had followed since 1980 to determine which filings it would select for review. Those criteria were the application of certain items to a company's filing history and financial condition that would lead us to decide whether we'd review a filing or not. And since and that did not count as a review. Since a preliminary review involved a substantive evaluation of a company's disclosure, we decided that would count as a review for purposes of the division's filing review metrics and the review mandate. And so we created those different categories of review, and we decided that a preliminary review, a full traditional cover-to-cover review, and a financial statement review would count for purposes of Sarbanes-Oxley. That was all very focused on the mechanics of meeting the schedule. We had to build into all of that processes to meet the other criteria that were in 408 as well, and we did that. We also had to come up with a plan for a review cycle for all of these companies. And we felt it was entirely consistent with what we believed was important and what the Sarbanes-Oxley Act meant to convey to us, that it was very important to review a lot of companies a lot more frequently than once every 3 years. So in building our schedule, we came up with a plan to review those top 1,000 companies every year, whether that was a preliminary review, a full cover-to-cover review, or a financial statement review. For the second group of companies, which was the next 6,000 companies by market cap, we plan to preliminarily review each one of those companies and further review a third of them, so another 2,000 companies. And for the third group, which was all the remaining companies, many of which were very small companies, we plan to undertake a very high-level review for very material issues without undertaking a preliminary review. I'm going to say we had really great plans, we couldn't implement them unless we got more people. So that led to our next challenge, which was staffing. We needed accountants. We estimated that we needed 100 to 150 more accountants than we had. It's easy to just say, I need those people, now give them to me, but it's really not that easy. First of all, we had to convince agency leaders that CorpFin needed these people, and we had to lay out a very detailed plan, because for anyone who's worked in a federal agency, the SEC or anywhere, you know that every number when you're adding up your head count is important, and it's a well-fought battle to get that one person or that one additional person. You go and ask for another 150 to 200 people, you better have a very good plan. I think we had a pretty good plan, because when Alan and I walked out of the meeting with our request for, I think it was maybe like 175 people, I think it was the first time I received a high five from a division director. So I was going to take that as a win. Another challenge was, okay, great, we got approval to go out and find these people. The next problem was finding them. Our hands were a little bit tied by the federal government's competitive service hiring procedures, which great procedures to hire fairly, but didn't work for us because we were looking for really specialized people with very specialized skills, public company experience, accounting firm experience doing audits, understanding the universe of companies we were looking at. And for those of you who have any knowledge of federal government hiring and you know competitive service hiring procedures, you get a list. And you have to pick from the top 3 people on that list. People became very, very adept, people with accounting experience, very adept at applying for federal jobs and getting to the top of those lists. They were not the people we wanted. We didn't need people who could do bookkeeping or people who could do financial management. We needed people who had this very specialized experience. And so that resulted in our doing a pretty short but intense dog and pony show around Capitol Hill, saying, you got to give us a break from these procedures, which they did. So again, home run, go out and hire those people. The last challenge was, even with the workaround, where were those people and how did we convince them to come to the SEC? That proved to be quite a challenge. The agency ended up hiring a recruiter who did some work to help find people, help us convince people to come work with us. And we ultimately, substantially met our goal of hiring the accountants we needed. And many of those accountants are still in CorpFin. And that was a really, really great win for us. So to kind of close that discussion up, we struggled with hiring. We did the best we could. It wasn't as fast as we had hoped. We got pretty much what we needed. And after the end of the 3rd fiscal year, post Sarbanes-Oxley, we were able to advise our leadership, the commission, that we had reviewed every reporting company, whether it was a preliminary review, a full review, a financial statement review, every company that was required to file reports with us. We had to set aside until the next couple of years those companies that voluntarily filed reports, because our lead time in hiring all the accountants we needed it was rather lengthy. But CorpFin met that mandate, and everyone in the division was incredibly proud of what we had done. So it was a huge challenge. I see Alan laughing a lot. I'm sure he has some things to say, but I personally, I feel like I have a lot of things that we did in CorpFin that make me very proud of what the staff was able to do. Nothing is as important as what we did here. And nothing makes me more proud of what the CorpFin did to reach this mandate.
Yeah, and all I would say is, you should be. It was amazing. I think Shelley was given that Sunday off. No, it was the only thing I would. Shelley has absolutely accurately described, at least as I recall it, the things she in particular led the division through in getting this done. But for an audience that may not kind of understand, people think of CorpFin as writing rules and letting IPOs go effective and writing proxy statement, proxy no action letters. More than somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 or even more of the CorpFin headcount is involved in the review process. This is the guts of what CorpFin does. And it's really important, not, as Shelley said, because we're going to catch fraud or wrongdoing, because we're not in most cases, but because the division is an important check on the adequacy of disclosures. And three things that underlie what Shelley was talking about that I think are critically important. One, focus on the big companies. Do the 1,000 every year. When Enron imploded, and this was what I learned this like my first week on the job, when Enron imploded, it wiped out $70 billion of market cap, of investor money in the space of like 3 weeks. And you've got to blow up a lot of small cap companies to get $70 billion of shareholder value. Believe everything you hear that smaller companies don't have the rigor behind them and the resources to do it right. Fine. They're still the ones that are the ones you have. If there's anything to keep an eye on, it's the larger companies. Secondly, Emery, you can help out on this. What's the daily trading volume in the public equity markets?
What?
Rough order. 200 million, 2 trillion, 100
Bigger,
trillion.
yeah. Well, between all the dark pools and exchanges, more. Yeah, a lot.
Yeah,
A
huge.
big number. Yeah.
Huge. And, IPOs, a few hundred million or a few $billion a year at best.
Right.
So if you're should you be spending your time as a division looking at S1s and F1s, or should you be spending your time looking at 10Ks? Because people in the market trade on the basis of the 10Ks. And if you lose $100 in an IPO, it's the same $100 you lose when you buy a company in the secondary market and it goes bust. So the periodic reports are the things you have to focus on and not the IPOs. And the third thing, to go back to something I said at the very beginning of this, the numbers matter, which means you need the accountants to do the financial reviews. And I'm a lawyer, and so I don't mind saying this. When I got to CorpFin, we were lawyer top heavy. We're not. I don't think CorpFin is lawyer top heavy anymore, and that's the reason. So that's why what Shelley's talking about is so important.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and complicated legacy, really, of the change to the review program and the change of approach for CorpFin, in the sense that it really changed the relationship between CorpFin and companies in a lot of ways. And you combine that with the fact of public availability of comment letters, which came about right around the same time. That really made a big difference, I think, in the way people looked at the staff in the division and looked at, their own obligations and, tried to learn from what was going on at the SEC to try to enhance their own reporting capabilities. And I think that was a very interesting development that
Absolutely.
And the prospect
Dave, you've got a whole other program you could do in public comment letters. I'll tell you, just one sentence. It was not CorpFin's idea to make comment letters public. We got, the agency got tired of losing FOIA lawsuits. When we finally lost our 100th FOIA lawsuit and were required to post the comment letters, we said, we'll just put them out. And that did, as you say, and Shelley, I know, knows this better than anyone else on the screen, making those public letters, those comment letters public was hugely, for better or for worse, hugely important in changing the relationship between the Corp Fin review staff and corporate America.
One other thing that Corp Fin did was we had as a policy objective, and Sarbanes-Oxley sort of expedited our consideration of this, moving from quarterly and annual reports to greater reliance on current reports to get more information out. And the efforts of Alan and Shelley in that regard were highly instrumental in getting us to a point where more and more information was becoming required to be disclosed in real time, as opposed to in significant periods of hindsight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that contributes to another legacy of all of this, in that the enhanced reliability or confidence in the financial reporting, the increased amount of information that was made available, and the staff's responsibilities to review that laid the groundwork, Alan, later for the securities offering reform efforts. Because
absolutely, we could not have done securities offering reform without those earlier changes. And Shelley talked about being proud of stuff. Among the things about which I am proudest are the changes we made to the current reporting system, to the 8Ks, and bringing, as Harvey said, completely revamping the disclosure system so that it's not a current system. And I firmly believe a current reporting system doesn't work, but this is an important event. You have to file it 8K. You can't wait 3 months to tell the world about it, and makes all the difference.
Absolutely. Well, and Marie, turning back to the topic you touched on earlier, so much was the SEC really wasn't in a position to tell public companies, how to run their board, but the exchanges had more leeway there, and through their relationship with companies, and the Blue Ribbon Commission had its work in the late 1990s, and was really addressing some big gaps, I think, in governance when we look back now at what we experience today versus what was in place in the late 1990s in terms of governance. And I'd be interested in hearing how that unfolded and what challenges were faced in getting the exchanges to sort of move forward with that and implement that, particularly when you had two major exchanges that were doing it at the same time.
Well, Alan, I think you mentioned, was it your first week of work at the SEC that WorldCom blew up? Is that what you said earlier? I think you're on mute.
You're on mute, Alan.
Or something close to when you started at the SEC, something big happened.
Well, Enron filed 2 weeks before I started.
Excellent. Well, I started at the New York Stock Exchange, the General Counsel's office, the day after Sarbanes-Oxley got adopted. And I'm sitting at my first big team meeting. I was supporting the international listings team, and George Zhu, who ran the team at the time, looked at me. He's like, "I don't know who you are, but you're a lawyer, right?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Okay, you're going to be the Sarbanes-Oxley point person." I'm like, "What the hell is Sarbanes-Oxley?" And so, for us, we had just worked through a massive rulemaking to promulgate all the rules the Blue Ribbon Committee had recommended, and had gone through the 19B4 process with trading and markets to get those obligations for listed companies in place. And also, to an earlier point, Alan, that you raised, I think the biggest impact for us from a corporate governance point of view, from a listing standard point of view, and from a company retention point of view was the audit committee obligations. And so I started my career at the SEC in CorpFin. I was in international CorpFin for 5 years. So my real focus was foreign companies listing in the US. And what the proposed audit committee rules did was basically preclude companies from a lot of international jurisdictions from being listed and registered with the SEC, listed in the US and registered with the SEC. You mentioned Germany. That was a very large problem area. Japan was another. There were multiple jurisdictions around the world where companies actually could not legally meet the obligations of the original proposed rules for the audit committee composition and the way that it would work. So we spent, the better part of 6 months, I think it was, flying around the world, meeting with listed companies, digging in with law firms, digging in with accounting experts to come up with, I think, some really good and really substantive comment letters and a good number of very, very helpful meetings with the staff, Alan and his entire staff, working through the issues. And that really, I think, did result in formal final rules being approved that meant that companies could remain listed in the US. I think that was exactly what you were saying earlier, Alan, like a really good outcome of, the legislation says this, but it just won't work. And so here's what we need to do in order to make that happen. The new rules did have an impact on our international listings pipeline. Companies really decided to hold off coming to the United States until they saw where things settled down. So that was, I think, something that we dealt with at the NYSE. But, I think most listed companies just stepped up to the additional obligations once we created a new framework for the audit committee obligation. One thing I'll remember, one of my favorite parts of the whole Sarbanes-Oxley rulemaking process and commission process, and not that he disagreed or would vote against, but one of my favorite moments was at the commission hearing when Paul Atkins stood up with his Far Side poster of how the deer with the target bull mark on his chest saying, "Bummer," both Mark Hallen and Paul was talking about his concerns about the audit committee financial expert obligation that was part of the rules. And ultimately that ended up not being a big issue for companies or for audit committee members. So I think it all worked out very well in the end, and you've got a great level of accountability. And I know, having been the general counsel of a public company also, people take the certifications really seriously. And really, I think that added a really important level of thoughtfulness around the preparation of financial statements and the preparation of periodic disclosure obligations. So you guys did a great job in a really hard circumstance.
Great, yeah, and I guess that, sort of going back to our original thesis, I wonder, the things that we take for granted today, independent boards of directors, independent audit committees, compensation committees, and nominating governance committees, the level of engagement and involvement of members of those committees, particularly at the audit committee level in the company's financial reporting, could those things have come about if it wasn't for this era of crisis and lack of confidence and ultimately legislative effort and the effort of the SEC and the exchanges? Was that sort of the predicate to people waking up from where things stood from a governance perspective, in the lead up to all this in the late 1990s and early 2000s?
I would just say, going to Shelley's point, like, the staff is not best placed to identify fraud, right? The staff is reviewing registration statements, they're reviewing periodic reports, they are experts in disclosure, they understand what needs to be there. But if there's fraud in the financial statements, they're not best placed to find that fraud. And I think the implications of Sarbanes-Oxley were that the obligation, as I said a little minute ago, on the audit committee, the obligation on the financial statement accountability became the obligation of the audit committee and senior management. I think that that sea change wouldn't have happened without Sarbanes-Oxley. And I think it really is a critical, disincentive to accounting fraud. Even today, there's always going to be accounting fraud. Companies, don't always do the right thing, but now there's real accountability if things go wrong, which I think gives the public a lot more confidence in public periodic reports.
Agreed. Yeah, I guess that.
I mean, Anne Marie, all I would say is I was in boardrooms before I joined the SEC in 2002, and I was in boardrooms after I left the SEC in 2006. And the difference between 2002 and 2010, 12 is like night and day.
Yes.
You really did the old joke, and it wasn't quite this bad, but it was, if you were on the board, your 3 jobs were to be there on time, not fall asleep, and eat the sandwiches. That's not the way boards behave anymore. It really isn't. And I think that what happened in 02, 03, 04 had a lot to do with that.
Agree.
I guess
Harvey, I suspect you saw the same thing in your pre-SEC and Calorama practices. It's a different ballgame.
It's a very different world. People are far more sensitive to what their obligations are. I think one thing we also should note is that while Sarbanes-Oxley dealt with public companies, it had an enormous impact as well on not-for-profit companies, because there weren't comparable standards, and Sarbanes-Oxley by default became the standards at not-for-profits as well. So the impact in terms of the boardroom was enormous. People would sit there and say, well, what do we look to? And of course, what they look to is Sarbanes-Oxley and the standards it had implemented. So it's, in that sense, the corporate governance aspect of it was really far-reaching.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up, obviously we can all agree that the PCOB and internal control were huge legacies of the Sarbanes-Oxley that sort of eclipsed the field to some extent in terms of things that came about as a result of the legislation that weren't there before. I guess I'd be interested in the panel's perspectives on, what do you think was one of the most important legacies coming out of the Act?
If I can go first, since I was in the public realm when all this happened, I would say it's a public company, and from a stock exchange point of view, it's the much more increased review of periodic reports. I think that was absolutely critical to people getting confidence back in the U.S. markets, and I think that was really a very significant. You put the audit committee stuff aside and whatever else, but the ramp up of the review periods for really large companies, I think, was something that really changed market dynamics in a significant way and let people feel more confident that companies weren't going to explode like these other ones did.
And I'll add to that by saying that another former division director, not Alan, said the mere threat of a review is as powerful as a review. And that really resonated with me because companies knew that they were going to be reviewed. And when Sarbanes-Oxley was adopted and we started this regular schedule of reviews, there were a lot of large reporting companies who had not heard from us in a very long time. They were very unhappy to receive a comment letter. They were very unhappy to have their disclosure questioned. And they were very unhappy that this was all happening to them. So then flash forward to, 10 years later, 20 years later, those companies will reach out to the staff, the disclosure review staff, discuss what is coming up, so there are no surprises, because Sarbanes-Oxley really led to a no surprises environment. They will talk to people on the staff about making sure that they address disclosure concerns before they make their filing, because it is so much easier to do that rather than after they make their filing. And so thank you for the lead in there, Anne Marie. That 408 and the mandated reviews and the regular and systematic reviews has really been extraordinarily impactful.
Dave, I would apply a similar analysis to I know you left the accounting stuff to the side, and I understand that about this program, but what Sarbanes-Oxley did with audit committees, and it made them the arbiters of the relationship. It gave the board a significant role in governance. It gave them the ability to stand up to the CFO. It meant that they were the guys. They were the group that had the final conversation with the auditor in the case of a controversial issue. That wasn't just about audit committees. I mean, I think it may be a word that's in bad odor these days, but the penumbra of the audit committee governance philosophy of Sarbanes-Oxley, I think in very significant ways changed the relationship between corporate boards and management. And that's a hugely important legacy. It started with audit committees, but it's not really limited anymore to audit committees. We've already mentioned the other lasting legacy, I think, and is the way companies think about disclosure, both in terms of process and timing. Companies take disclosure more seriously now than they used to. And 408 is a big part of it, as Shelley pointed out, but the other aspects of the act are also a big part of it, and the current disclosure changes are also a big part of it. So that's the other thing that I think Sarbanes-Oxley gave us that's kind of much bigger than any of its parts.
I think I agree, obviously, with all that's been said. One other thing was the relationship between the SEC staff and the companies that were subject to SEC regulation. This was a period in which there was a great amount of communication. The staff was out talking to people. We were very concerned about what would work, what wouldn't work, how to make corporate governance issues respond to what Congress wanted. And there was a newfound credibility, I think, for the agency and the way it went about its efforts, which is solely attributable to the staff and the like. But I think that was another enormous impact that Sarbanes-Oxley had in restoring the dialogue, and everyone was effectively working toward the same goal and the same end. And I think that has been a lasting legacy of the act as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I think those were great perspectives on this topic, and it was really good to look back. It's hard to believe 20 years have gone by, but we definitely have learned a lot from what happened then and what we know now. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Jim to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and great job. It's amazing to hear from the people who are on the ground, the birth of this law that we kind of take for granted now, but how it happened is just fascinating. So thank you all, Harvey, Shelley, Emery, and Alan, for your thoughtful insights, comments, and recollections. I also want to thank Deloitte & Touche, whose generous and longstanding support for the society has helped make this program possible, and the overall corporate disclosure gallery. And thank you, John Bogley of All Ends Meet, for your technical assistance. For anyone that was unable to attend here today, the archived version of the program will be available in a few days on our homepage, and will be added to the permanent collection within the museum. And I understand that some of the viewers may not have been able to see the introductions or possibly the opening of the webcast, but it'll be available. It'll be recorded and in there for your viewing pleasure. Before I let everyone go, I'd be remiss in my role as president if I didn't make a plug for your support. Our organization depends solely on financial gifts from folks like you, from companies, and it allows us to preserve the history. As you've seen here, it's a very rich and unique history of our securities markets with like the program today. And you know, every dollar goes a long way. And if you're interested in supporting the organization, when you go on the homepage, there's a Give Today button that you can click on. And we really appreciate your continuing support and new supporters. So thanks again to the panelists for a terrific program, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.